Good morning, class. How are you? I hope you're safe and fine in your house. And many people have started coming for the offline class also. And it's good to see them after a long time. Now, children, I'm going to revise a new lesson with you today, and that is the address introduction. Now, first of all, children, let me tell you about the author, the writer of this lesson, Marga Manco. Marga Manco was the author, the author of this lesson. And children, is a story. This story is written during World War II. Okay, so let me tell you about the introduction and the background of the story. So the address is a moving short story of Marga Manco. During World War II, Germany invades Holland. So children, it was in World War II, Germany invades Holland. A woman with her daughter has to flee from her home. So there, a woman with her daughter, she has to flee from her home. The mother dies long after the war. The daughter comes back to her town. She meets the woman with whom her mother had left all her belongings. The woman even refused to recognize her, nor does she show any intention of returning the thing she has in her possession. So children, they have to, a mother and daughter was there and they have to leave the house for some reason, and they have kept all her belongings in a house, and they have a friend of her mother, and she had promised them that she will keep them safely, and when they will return back she will give all the things to them. The mother could not come. She sent her daughter, but children, when she come to her house after finding the address with great difficulty, it seems that not only she pretend to identify her, she did not even, children, pretend to not to identify her, but also she is not having any intention to return all the belonging or the thing that was her possession. The narrator given up the idea of getting them back again. She decided to leave all of them behind. She resolved to forget the address where those belongings lie unceremoniously in unpleasant surroundings. Now children, for two reasons she did not want to take the bag. First of all, their intention was not good. Children, now those things were in the unpleasant surroundings. She didn't want to have that. Secondly, children, whenever she will see her, it will remind of her about her mother, mm, whom children she don't not want to remind, because she used to love her mother very much, and it is very painful to remind. Whenever she will see her things, her mother's thing, she will never be able to. It will always remind her, which she did not want to do. Now I will be telling you about the summary, okay, point by point. So my first point is that first point, Mrs. S daughter, as written in the story. Okay, they flee due to World War II, and when the war is over, Mrs. H sent her daughter to visit number 46. Okay, number 46, Marconi Street. So this is the address, children. The whole address is this, about which you can see the title of the lesson is the address. So it is of this address she is telling. Mrs. S is a children lady whose daughter is the narrator, and she visit number 46 Marconi Street, because when her mother had to flee due to World War II. Okay, she had kept all her belonging in Mrs. Darling's house. So, and she did not want to give all those belongings. So let me tell you something about first point. Mrs. S daughter visit number 46 Marconi Street. So the narrator children, she finds anyhow number 46 Marconi Street, and now she was at number 46 Marconi Street. She was the daughter of Mrs. S. And children, when she find out, she pressed the bell. A woman opened the door. She looked at the newcomer searchingly. When that she saw her, she came as if she wanted to ask her searchingly. She wanted to know who she was. She was Mrs. Darling. And children, the woman who had opened the door, she was Mrs. Darling. The narrator introduced herself. Narrator introduced herself to her. The woman's face showed absolutely no sign of recognition. Now, children, purposely that woman was not able to recognize her. She kept staring at her in silence. The girl had once seen the woman years ago. She realized that perhaps she had rung the wrong bell. Now, children, even the girl, she is not sure whether she had is that woman only or not. Because she had seen that lady many years back. She realized that perhaps she had rung the wrong bell, but soon her doubt was set to rest. The woman was wearing her mother's green knitted cardigan. So children, she thought she must have reached to the wrong address, otherwise they might be not able to recognize her. But children, when she saw the cardigan of Mrs. Darling, she was sure that she has reached the right address, as she was wearing the green knitted cardigan which belongs to her mother. Now, the second point is that the woman refused to recognize the narrator. Okay. Now, children, when she rings the bell, purposely, children, she did not recognize her. In fact, she refused to recognize her. The girl asked the woman if she still knew her. Mrs. Darling replied that she did not. She stand there dumbfounded. So she pretended as if she is dumbfounded. The narrator then told her that she was the daughter of Mrs. S. The woman asked, "Have you come back?" It was clear that she was not pleased to see the girl again. Now, children, first of all, children, when she introduced herself that she is the daughter of Mrs. S. Okay. First of all, her first question was, "Have you come back?" That means, children, she was pretending not to recognize her, because it was her first question to the narrator that, "Have you come back?" That means she was recognize her, but she was pretending not to recognize her. Otherwise, she would have told her, "I don't know who are you and to whom you are talking." Okay, you're talking about whom? But nothing such question was asked. It was only asked to her, "Have you come back?" It was clear that she was not pleased to see the girl again. Until then, it was very much clear that she was not pleased to see that girl again. The girl replied that she was only one who survived and come back. Now, children, what did the girl reply? She told, yes, she had come back and she is the only one who is surviving now, and she had come back. The woman expressed regret that she could not do anything for her. Now, children, in a very regretful manner, the woman told her that she could not do anything for her. The narrator told her that she had come especially for her by train. Now, children, the narrator told her that she had come especially to meet Mrs. Darling by train from some very far away, because she wanted to take all her belongings. The lady showed her helplessness by not able to recognize them intentionally. She was not ready to entertain the girl. Not leave that children. She did not even call the girl inside her house. She was not ready to entertain the girl. She could come at another time. And children, she told her that she could come another time. So the narrator thought, now children, my third point is the narrator thought of her mother. So this is the third point. The narrator thought of her mother. Okay, so the third point of the whole story is the narrator, she thought of her mother. The narrator got lost in old memories. She thought about her mother. She had given her the address of Mrs. Darling's years ago. Holland was war-stricken. It had been in the first half of the war. She remembered how she came home for a few days. She noticed that various things in the house were missing. Her mother then told her about Mrs. Darling. She had never heard of her before. Clearly, Mrs. Darling must have been an old acquaintance of her mother. Suddenly, Mrs. Darling started coming regularly to their house. Now, children, narrator started thinking of her mother. The narrator, children, she was lost in her old memory. She thought of her mother. Now her mother is no more. When she came to the things away from Mrs. Darling, she had given her the address of Mrs. Darling years ago. Children, the mother of the narrator, she had given the address of Mrs. Darling long years ago. Holland was war-stricken. Okay. At that time, children, during the World War II, Germany invades Holland and it was war-stricken. It had been in the first half of the war. She remembered how she came home for a few days. She noticed that various things in the house were missing. Her mother then told her about Mrs. Darling. She had never heard of her before. Clearly, Mrs. Darling must have been an old acquaintance of her mother. Suddenly, Mrs. Darling started coming regularly in their house. Now, children, she started remembering all this about Mrs. Darling, that how she started coming to her house. Earlier, she never used to come, but one day when the narrator found that many things of her house were missing, and then she saw Mrs. Darling often come to her house and taking lot of things from her mother. Then when she asked her mother, then she told that since we may have to leave, so all the things I am giving to Mrs. Darling. Now, children, Mrs. Darling's earlier she never used to come. She had never seen her, but then, children, the fourth point is that Mrs. Darling's frequent visit. Mrs. Darling frequent visit. Okay. Mrs. Darling came frequently. Every time she visited, she took something with her. One day she took all the silverware. So one day, children, all the silverwares were taken by Mrs. Darling. Then she took away the antique plates hung on the wall, and after that she had taken all the antique plates which were hung in the wall. Mrs. S told her daughter that Mrs. Darling wanted to save all her articles. Now, children, Mrs. Darling, she told her mother that she wanted to save all her articles. It was her time if they have to leave the place. Now, children, it was a war time and they have to leave the place and any time, so they would lose everything. So she told that they may lose everything, so it is good to hand her over, and when they will come back, they will take the things from Mrs. Darling. And it was Mrs. Darling intention to save all the thing. Now, since it was a war time and they have to leave the place, so they started handing her over all the thing. The daughter wanted to know if there was a written agreement that Mrs. Darling would return all the articles safely. Now, children, the daughter asked, have you made any written um, agreement that Mrs. Darling would return all the articles safely? The girl could not trust anyone so blindly. Children, the narrator, she was a very intelligent girl. She could not trust anyone so blindly. But Mrs. S replied that it was not necessary because she is her friend and she will never do all that thing. Mrs. S was thankful. In fact, Mrs. S told to her daughter that she was thankful to Mrs. Darling for what she was doing for her. So all that happened years ago. So this is still when Mrs. Darling did not return her thing. It was the narrator who was thinking all this thing. Well, when it was not her intention that she did not want to entertain her. So children, narrator left the place, and then children, the fifth point is the narrator visit Mrs. Darling's house second time. So she left the place, and finally she decided that she would visit Mrs. Darling's house, okay, second time to take the things of her mother. So the narrator first visited, she did not get anything. It was not a fruitful visit. So children, narrator thought she would visit for the second time, because as the first visit was not very rewarding. She paid a second visit to see Mrs. Darling. This time she found her 15-year-old daughter in the house. When she went for the second time, she found that her 15-year-old daughter was in the house. Mrs. Darling at that time was not present in the house. So children, first she thought to wait for Mrs. Darling. So children, she thought that she would wait for Mrs. Darling. Okay, as Mrs. Darling was not there, and she decided to wait for Mrs. Darling. Okay, well, she came to her house, and since her mother had handed all the things to Mrs. Darling, so without Mrs. Darling's permission, she could not take all these things away. So children, let me write the 6th point for you people. The 6th point is that the daughter sees her mother's belongings. The daughter sees her mother's belonging in Mrs. Darling's house. Okay, so she came, Mrs. Darling daughter was there this time. She called the girl inside, and she went inside the house. She started waiting for Mrs. Darling to come so that she could take the permission to take all her things away from her. And when she went to her house, children, what she found, the narrator found herself in the middle of the things which once upon a time they belonged to her mother. She wanted to see them again. All those things were taken away by Mrs. Darling and kept here in her house. She remembered how cleverly Mrs. Darling she came to her house, and how foolish her mother was to give all the things to Mrs. Darling, which now she was in front of her and which was kept in her house. She was pained to note that they were arranged tastelessly. Now, children, the worst thing was that she was pained to note that they were arranged tastelessly. The ugly furniture and the muggy smell upset her. Children, the furniture inside Mrs. Darlingham's was very ugly, and muggy smell upset her. The girl brought tea for her. Now, children, the daughter of Mrs. Darling, she bought tea for her. Then she opened a box and took some spoons out of it. Then, children, she opened a box and she took some spoons out of it. Which was she was able to recognize that was the spoons of their. Okay. Then, children, the narrator also looked at the antique plate which she came to know it was belonging to her mother. She knew that all the cutlery, knives, fork and spoon which were made of silver, and they were belonging to them only. Her mother had told her about them when she was alive. So she also not even that, children, she not only recognizes but she remembered that her mother told her about everything when she was alive. So, children, she knew that they are using it and they will not give to her. Now, children, the last point is that the narrator, that means the writer, resolve Okay, so children, you can see the narrator resolves to forget the things. Okay, the narrator, this is the seventh point, the narrator resolved to forget the things and the address where her mother's belonging was kept. So this is the seventh point which I have written on the board. And children, the narrator, children, she was not able to tolerate that how badly those things were kept and how badly they were used. They were kept in a very, children, not in a very good manner. Okay, the narrator jumped up and she decided that she will not take the thing because she was once having doubt also, since they were using it. So Mrs. Darling might not give them to her. And children, she jumped up. She must catch her train. She could not wait for Mrs. Darling. She came out and read the number. It was 46 Marconi Street. Then, children, she thought whether she is in the right house or not. Again, she read the number of her house. It was quite correct. It was 46 Marconi Street. The address was totally correct. But she wanted to forget the address. She resolved not to go there. Those nice things were once the belonging of her mother. Now, children, after that, she had taken the resolution that the nice things, the silver cutlery, fork, spoons, they were all the belongings of her mother, and she knew that Mrs. Darling's intention was not to give them. So she decided to forget all the things, and she decided to forget the address. She resolved not to go there. Those nice things were once the belonging of her mother. They reminded her of her former time. Now, children, when she saw all that thing, it reminded everything, every children moment. It reminded her of her mother, that how she used to use it and how children wish she was not able to children tolerate it. Those nice things were once the belonging of her mother. They reminded her of her former time. Children, she started remembering the time which she had passed with her mother, but they had lost their value. But now these things had no and not have any value for her, because she felt that now these are very badly are used by Mrs. Darling, and she will never give it to her. So now they had lost their value. Their true honor no longer existed, and now moreover children, the true honor of those belonging, that is her mother, she is no more. She died. They were in strange surroundings. She had to forget them and the address where they were still lying. And children, these belongings, they were not kept in the nice surrounding, and she had to forget the children address, and not only address but the belongings of her mother. So, and she decided not to go back to that place again to take the thing. Now, children, the thing is that why did the Margaret want to forget the address? So the narrator of the story, the daughter of Mrs. S, want to forget the address. Actually, the narrator goes to 46 Marconi Street to meet Mrs. Darling. She goes there in search of her mother's belonging, in fact, to take all her belongings. The narrator mother's hand over all her articles to Mrs. Darling before leaving her town during the war. Mrs. Darling assured her that she will remain safe in her hand. There is no written agreement. The narrator is not at all convinced with this. She had no faith in Mrs. Darling, and children, this happened also after the war. When she returned back, the narrator makes an effort to see Mrs. Darling, but the woman refused even to recognize her. She does not give all her belongings even when she told her that she is the daughter of Mrs. S. Her remarks was that, "Have you come back again?" reveals so many things. Mrs. Darling does not want to receive the narrator, nor has she any intentions of returning the belonging of her dead mother to her. During her second visit, the narrator can't meet Mrs. Darling. She is not at home. Her daughter is alone in the house. The narrator sees everything there. All the silver cutlery, antiques, antique plates and big vases are there, but they are useless now. Their true honor is no more in this world. The narrator resolved never to go there again. She wants to forget the address, which is of no use to her now. Now, children, this address is a story of human predicament that follow war. So, Marga Manco's, this is the story written by Marga's Manco. The address describes human predicament that follows war. The war had taken even Hollands in its grip. People had no safety of themselves and their property. During the war, Mrs. S was uprooted. She had to leave the city and even her house with her daughter. She handed all her belongings to Mrs. Darling. All her costly silver cutlery, antique plates and vessels were taken away by Mrs. Darling. At last, children, the war was over. Things began to return to normalcy. Everything was becoming normal. The fear of the war gave place to peace now. There was peace everywhere. But children, the worst thing was there. The narrator's mother died. She was alone when she came back to her town. She went to Darling's house in search of the belonging of her mother. She was received very coldly by Mrs. Darling. She even refused to recognize her. She asked her to come at another time. The war upset the narrator and her family. She was alone to face the world. She had no sympathy. Mrs. Darling proved ungrateful. She did not even acknowledge that she owed anything to the narrator. So children, Mrs. Darling's behavior was, she did not behave in a children uh, in a very justified manner. Instead of giving the girl all her mother's belonging, she is now wanted to have them, and in fact she did not even want to recognize her. Um, well children, second time when she came, the narrator had been at Mrs. Darling house with her daughter for quite some time. She was so she when the daughter returned, children, when she came back for the second time, she wanted to forget everything, even the address and the thing. They children, there was a strange feeling the narrator felt. She did not long to possess them. Now their true honor was no more in this world. It was better to forget them and the uncharitable Mrs. Darling. She also wanted to forget the address, which symbolized a tragic past. So children, with this I have told you all the background of the story, and I conclude my video here. Now next my video I will be explaining you the story. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.